This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Fareed Zakaria, coming to you live from New York. Today on the show, the White House in disarray, warring with the Attorney General, leakers, and senators. What does all this mean for policy, from Russia to healthcare to gender issues in the military? And what does the world make of this circus? I have a great panel to talk about it all. And America's new nationalism. Ronald Reagan's Republican Party was all about free markets. America closes its. I will talk about the eastward shift of global power with the FT's Gideon Rachman. Finally, summer on the French Riviera. Instead of hot parties this year, unfortunately, all the talk is of scorching fires. I'll explain. But first, here's my take. In London last week, I met a Nigerian man who succinctly expressed the reaction of much of the world to America these days. The country has gone crazy, he said, with a mixture of outrage and amusement. I'm from Africa. I know crazy, but I didn't ever think I would see this in America. The world has gone through bouts of anti-Americanism before, but this one feels very different. First, there is the sheer shock at what is going on, the bizarre candidacy of Donald Trump, which has been followed by an utterly chaotic presidency. The chaos is at such a fever pitch that one stalwart Republican, Karl Rove, described the president this week as vindictive, impulsive, and short-sighted, and his public shaming of the Attorney General as unfair, unjustified, unseemly, and stupid. Another Republican, Kenneth Starr, the one-time Grand Inquisitor of Bill Clinton, went further, calling Trump's treatment of Jeff Sessions one of the most outrageous and profoundly misguided courses of presidential conduct I have witnessed in 5 decades in and around the nation's capital. But there's a larger aspect to the fall in respect for America. According to a recent Pew Research Center study of 37 countries, people around the world increasingly believe that they can make do without America. Trump's presidency has made the U.S. something worse than feared. It is becoming irrelevant. The most fascinating finding of the Pew survey was not that Trump is deeply unpopular, 22% approval compared to Obama's 64% at the end of his presidency. That was to be expected, but that there are now alternatives. On the question of confidence in various leaders to do the right thing regarding world affairs, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin got slightly higher marks than Trump. But Angela Merkel got almost twice as much support as Trump. Even in the United States, more respondents expressed confidence in the German chancellor than Trump. This says a lot about Trump, but it says as much about Merkel's reputation and how far Germany has come since 1945. Trump has managed to do something that fear of Putin could not. He has unified Europe. Facing the challenges of Trump, Brexit, and populism, a funny thing has happened on the continent. Support for Europe among its residents has risen, and plans for deeper European integration are underway. If the Trump administration proceeds as it has promised and initiates protectionist measures against Europe, the continent's resolve will only strengthen. Under the combined leadership of Merkel and the new French President Emmanuel Macron, Europe will adopt a more activist foreign policy. Its economy has rebounded and is now growing as fast as that of the United States. Countries from Canada to China have in various ways announced that since Washington cannot be relied on to shape the global agenda anymore, others will step in its place. The most dismaying aspect of Pew's findings is that the drop in regard for America goes well beyond Trump. 64% of the people surveyed expressed a favorable view of America at the end of the Obama presidency. That has now fallen to 49%. Even when American foreign policy was unpopular, people around the world still believed in America, the place, the idea. This is less true today. In 2008, I wrote a book about the emerging post-American world, which was, I noted at the start, not about the decline of America, but rather about the rise of the rest. Amidst the parochialism, ineptitude, and sheer disarray of the Trump presidency, the post-American world is coming to fruition much faster than I ever expected. For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. Okay, you heard my take. Let's bring in a great panel to discuss these issues and more. Joining me here in New York are Tim Naftali, a CNN presidential historian and the former director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, Julian Zelizer, political historian at Princeton and a CNN political analyst. In D.C., Robin Wright joins us. She writes for The New Yorker and is a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. And David Frum joins us from L.A. He is a senior editor of The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. Julian, I want to start with you because it feels to me like we are at a very important moment in terms of congressional reaction to Donald Trump, Republican reaction. When the Sessions thing broke, you saw senior Republicans like Mitch McConnell publicly disagreeing with Trump in absolutely flat-out terms. On the Russia sanctions, they are passing a bill that the White House did not want. On health care, 3 Republican senators voted against. But I want to read you, Stephen Perlstein in the Washington Post had this wonderful story where he tells that Lisa Murkowski, very conservative senator, is called by the Secretary of Interior threatening that they will no longer support projects of hers in Alaska. She responds by essentially dissing the White House and the Department of Interior, voting against the health care bill, and then postponing all hearings on Interior Department jobs and on its 2018 budget. This feels like a Republican revolt against Donald Trump.
It's beginning. I think we often hear a lot about the importance of the base to President Trump and how he crafts most of his strategy around the base. But really, it's the Republican Party that protects him, and it's the Republican Party upon which he depends, broadly defined. And this week, all the events you've talked about, I think, are some cumulative evidence that the firewall of the Republican Congress is starting to weaken, if not fall apart. And this is very significant. He can't afford this. And with the story of Attorney General Sessions, for example, we've seen ongoing pushback, which is making it difficult for him to do what seems to be the move he's looking for so that he can go after the special prosecutor.
David Frum, let me read you from your old place of employment. You were a editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal. The Journal, part of Rupert Murdoch's empire, has generally been very supportive of Trump and very critical of his opponents. So let me read you what the Journal has said this week about Trump's Sessions abuse. He is harming himself, alienating allies, and crossing dangerous legal and political lines. If Trump wants to blame someone for the existence of Special Counsel Mueller, he can pick up a mirror. On the health care bill, he never tried to sell the policy to the American public, in part because he knows nothing about health care and couldn't bother to learn. On Priebus, this shuffling of the staff furniture won't matter unless Mr. Trump accepts that the White House problem isn't Mr. Priebus, it's him. Now, in the past, conservative intellectuals like yourself denouncing Trump have not made much difference. Are we seeing something new?
We are seeing something new because the Wall Street Journal does speak with.
And we are back with Tim Naftali, Julian Zelizer, Robin Wright, and David Frum. Robin, you traveled to North Korea at what was the highest level of contact between the United States government and the North Korean government, really ever in its history. What do you make of what is going on in North Korea and Trump's response to it, which seemed a kind of series of random tweets about the Chinese?
Well, it's very dangerous, actually. We are now at a point where the North Korean capabilities are so sophisticated. They have a range now of over 6,000 miles for their intercontinental ballistic missiles. We are at a point also where the window for diplomacy is beginning to close. And the president, rather than working this issue, as he's preoccupied with his war at home, is not taking the kind of steps that will get us closer to resolution that will diminish the threat. He is treating the president of China the same way he's treating Jeff Sessions. He's belittling President Xi Jinping in tweets. He's saying that the Chinese are doing nothing for us. This is not the way to deal with the most populous nation on earth, the only nation on earth that can really help us with whether it's imposing sanctions on North Korea or engaging in some kind of diplomatic resolution. The reality is that North Korea is reaching the point that it's going to be a nuclear power, and there's very little the United States can do about it except try to diminish the dangers of North Korea using it. And so President Trump has put us in a very vulnerable position by not dealing more thoughtfully and diplomatically with this fundamental challenge, the one that may well define his foreign policy legacy.
Robin, let me ask you about another one, because you're so knowledgeable about Iran. There are reports that Donald Trump, more than reports, he's essentially publicly said he wants to find them in non-compliance with the Iran deal, even though the IAEA, the agency appointed to look at it, has several times certified that they are in compliance. What would happen if the United States, in a sense, unilaterally disagreeing with international, the inspectors on the ground, would say, we believe that Iran is in non-compliance?
Well, the Trump administration clearly wants to force Iran to walk away from the deal, to nudge them in or confront them in any number of ways, not just on the nuclear deal. Yes, through inspections, possibly demanding inspection of sites that are not on the list or not suspected of having been involved in a nuclear program, but also in ways, whether it's imposing new sanctions, opening fire on Iranian ships in the Persian Gulf, imposing sanctions because of the detention of Americans, that there are a lot of ways that we're moving toward, I think, a position that the United States looks like it is supporting regime change. And I saw, as you did too, the Iranian foreign minister, and I think the idea that the Iranians are going to walk away from this is unlikely. And that puts us in the position of what is our policy? We are now split with the Europeans. 40 years we've been together in trying to pressure Iran on its nuclear program and other issues, and now the Europeans are going ahead and doing business with them, or, putting their ambassadors back in Tehran. And so, this is where the president lacks the kind of sophisticated knowledge of the world. It was reflected this week when he stood next to the Lebanese prime minister and said that Lebanon was on the front line of fighting ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, of course, is a major part of the Lebanese government, and it's fighting alongside the Lebanese army today against ISIS and Al-Qaeda in eastern Lebanon. It's really disheartening when you understand that President Trump knows so little about the world.
Julian, you think these crises are an opportunity or a challenge?
I think they're a challenge. I think the same problems we've seen play out with domestic policy will recreate themselves on foreign policy. So all of the presidential behavior that we've seen, threatening allies and opponents, tweeting randomly and distracting not the public from what he's doing, but his own party from what they need to be doing, and lacking some real sense of policy and a vision, as Robin's talking about, in terms of where this all goes. All of those will be problematic as this turns to the international stage.
David, from another seeming distraction, or at least some people would regard as a distraction, was the transgender issue. What do you think Trump was doing there? And I'm assuming it's an attempt to play the sort of culture war card and force Democrats to have to defend a very, small minority that many people would regard as odd. I don't. But will it work?
It's a culture war that actually turned into a culture skirmish because, as you said, there just isn't enough excitement about this issue, one side or the other. And it is a sign of how the president has a tendency to start his wars without allies and without preparation. And that is a very ominous warning for the larger and non-metaphorical wars that may lie ahead of him. It is really worrying, as Julian was just saying now. The United States is stumbling without plans, often without friends, into confrontations it doesn't seriously intend to make good on, but that may be real. One of the clever things that people say in Washington is, what happens if these guys ever encounter a crisis that is not of their own making? What happens when they face a true international crisis? But the situation is much worse than that, because this team is an international crisis. This is itself, this government is the greatest threat to America's national security we've seen maybe since the end of the Cold War. We are careening, we are going to end up in some kind of confrontation, and we're going to probably end up there alone.
Tim Naftali, when you look at the way this administration is handling itself, something that Richard Haass said to me, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, he said, looking at Scaramucci, looking at so much, he said, nobody seems to care about the dignity of the office that they hold. And that starts with the president, but it goes down throughout the White House. There is no sense that these offices are kind of national treasures.
No, there's no sense of that, and that has an effect, has a corrosive effect, in three different ways. One, imagine the morale of the people.
Now for $1 trillion. At the end of May, the Trump administration released details of its proposed budget for the next fiscal year. And on July 13th, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released their analysis of President Trump's budget. The CBO says the president's budget underestimated the loss in federal tax revenues caused by its proposed tax cuts by a whopping $3.4 trillion. How could the smart Goldman Sachs guys on Trump's economic team, Gary Cohn, Steve Mnuchin, make such a big, basic math error? Actually, they did it intentionally. The administration assumed that because of its tax cuts, the American economy would grow by 3% a year for the next decade. The CBO instead says the president's plan would increase GDP growth to 1.9%, which most economists agree is the sensible assumption. Note that the American economy has grown on average just 1.8% over the last 15 years, no more. This method of fudging the numbers is called dynamic scoring. Common sense would tell you that if the government cuts taxes, it'll get less money in tax revenues. But sprinkle the magic pixie dust of dynamic scoring, and you can project much higher growth rates, and then the revenue numbers soar upwards in theory. The story of dynamic scoring is the story of the Republican Party's abandonment of facts, science, and analysis in favor of ideology. Decades ago, Republicans were advocates of fiscal restraint. They were the party of green eye shades, conservative assumptions, and careful accounting. They did not believe in wide-eyed assumptions and in counting chickens before they were hatched. In fact, when Ronald Reagan proposed tax cuts that he claimed would pay for themselves, his traditionalist Republican rival, George Bush Sr., derided his approach as voodoo economics. But with the Reagan Revolution came a new mantra. Tax cuts were the answer to every problem, and the economics could be bent to make it all work out in theory. In fact, the national debt tripled under Ronald Reagan. And after George W. Bush cut taxes, the national debt increased again. Bill Clinton, by contrast, actually raised taxes and ushered in stronger growth and higher tax revenues. But the mountains of evidence have not stopped Republicans from using dynamic scoring. In 2010, Kansas Governor Sam Brownback rode a Tea Party wave to power, and he soon slashed taxes across the board, predicting that there would be a boost to the Kansas economy and thousands of new jobs would be created. Except the promised growth never materialized. Instead, between 2013 and 2014, the state's budget of $6 billion was butchered as tax revenues fell by a massive $713 million. This year, there was a $280 million budget shortfall, forcing state legislators to pass tax hikes despite Brownback's opposition. In 2015, the GDP of the state grew by an anemic 0.2%, while the rest of the nation grew at 1.6%. Job growth since the cuts dropped to a dismal 3.5%, while the rest of the nation experienced a rate of 7.6%. Sam Brownback has been rewarded for his failure by being nominated this week to be the State Department's ambassador at large for international religious freedom by Donald Trump. Bruce Bartlett, who was a senior policy advisor to Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr., says that dynamic scoring is not about honest revenue estimating. It's about using smoke and mirrors to institutionalize Republican ideology into the budget process. Steve Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, and others in the administration know better. Conventional wisdom has it that there are two competing camps in the White House. The globalists, led by people like Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn, the director of the National Economic Council, and then there are the nationalists, led by one man, really, Steve Bannon. If you look at the major initiatives of the administration, from the Muslim travel ban to the Mexican border wall to pulling out of Paris, it would appear that the nationalists are the ones winning. Add to that the president's strongly nationalistic speech in Warsaw earlier this month, and it is quite obvious that Steve Bannon's side has the president's attention, at least for the moment. My next guest, Joshua Green, has written a book explaining the rise of Bannon and how the president's chief strategist came to his worldview. Welcome, Joshua.
It's good to be with you.
So the first question is, Bannon's worldview, as I say, seems to dominate, even with the transgender ban, but Bannon has disappeared. Is that part of a strategy? I assume he recognized that the one thing you can't do in this administration is be more prominent or even anyone close as prominent as the president.
Exactly right. And I think he learned that the hard way, because in the early days of the administration, he was portrayed in popular culture and media as being this dark mastermind, this puppet master, President Bannon, as Saturday Night Live called him. And as a White House advisor told me, Trump does not want to have a co-star, and especially not one who's believed to be pulling his puppet strings. So Bannon lost a bit of his influence then, and I think understands that you can exert more influence and survive longer in Trump's circle if you're behind the scenes whispering in his ear instead of on TV at the White House podium trying to explain Trump's ever-evolving policies.
So there's so much in the book, but I want to focus on one piece, which is really this transformation ideologically. The Republican Party used to be the party of free markets, free trade, openness. That was Reaganism. That was the kind of formula. And Trump and Bannon, both in their various ways, realized that the base of the Republican Party was in a very different place. Do you think that Bannon came to his nationalist, protectionist, populist views slowly, suddenly? What happened? This was a Goldman Sachs banker.
I traced two strains in the book that I think led Bannon to his worldview. The first is that he had a deeply traditional Catholic upbringing. He went to a right-wing Catholic military academy, became fascinated with traditionalist intellectuals, including some of the nationalist thinkers of the 1930s and the 1940s, who tended to believe that the world was in decline, that the Western world was under assault by the forces of Islam, by the rise of secular modernity. And then I think the other thing is Bannon's own personal experience. He served in the Navy in the Persian Gulf during the failed rescue mission to rescue the American hostages. And Bannon...
This was under the Carter presidency.
This was under Jimmy Carter's presidency. Bannon was raised in a working-class Irish Catholic, Democratic, pro-Kennedy family. So Bannon at the time was ostensibly a Democrat, but he described to me in interviews getting off the ship, taking shore leave in Pakistan, and being horrified and worried by what he described as these teeming masses of young anti-American Muslims. And then watching the hostage crisis, he described the Middle East to me as being primeval. He said it was like stepping back into the 5th century. And so I think that was the beginning, the roots of the Islamophobia that has characterized his politics and Trump's.
Trump seems to have understood, like a good salesman during the campaign, that what people wanted to hear out in the hustings for the Republican base, they didn't want to hear about Milton Friedman economics and free trade and, you know, entitlement reform, the kind of stuff Paul Ryan talks about. They wanted to hear about Mexicans, Muslims, Chinese people. So does he buy into the Bannon vision, or is this just a convenient kind of a marriage of expediency?
I think he does to an extent, but I think what Trump sees in the Bannon vision is not a philosophy or an intellectual underpinning for Trump's own ideas. I think what he sees is a powerful and effective campaign slogan, the idea of America First nationalism. Well, who could be against that? And Trump, with his salesman skills, was able to distinguish himself from what Bannon, what Trump would consider the globalist, pro-free trade, hawkish, orthodox republicanism that characterized the views of the other 16 candidates more or less in the GOP election. I think what Trump did, and Bannon certainly helped this, was to practice a kind of political arbitrage. He understood that the policies being offered and pushed by the Republican Party leaders no longer met the needs of the party's white, working class, increasingly rural and isolationist base, and took advantage of that in a way that exposed just how vulnerable the Republican Party really was.
What's striking to me about it is, you know, there's a few slogans about American elections. People often say the taller candidate always wins, which apparently is mostly true. But the other one is that the more optimistic candidate always wins. And what Bannon's worldview, whatever you may think of it, it's a very dark, pessimistic view of the world. As you say, a world in decline, a West in decline, you know, a kind of, you're surrounded, you're fighting to preserve the soul of America. Is that where half the country now is?
I think it is. And I
A wild week in Washington. Reince Priebus resigns.
I think the president wanted to go a different direction.
And Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly takes his place.
John Kelly is one of our great stars.
Plus, devastating defeat. John McCain's dramatic thumbs down tanks the health care bill.
Boy, oh boy. Can you believe that?
Can Republicans rally after an embarrassing loss?
No party can remain in power by lying to the American people.
One of only 3 Republican senators to vote no, Senator Susan Collins, joins me in minutes. And Democrats battle back.
I hope we can work together to make the system better.
Can Democrats use this victory?
We are back.
To strengthen their party's agenda. Senator Bernie Sanders is here live on What Comes Next. Hello, I'm Dick Tapper, where the state of our union is tense. After a Friday staffing shakeup, Secretary and retired Marine General John Kelly is now fewer than 24 hours away from officially starting his new job as White House Chief of Staff. And one of his first orders of business could be dealing with an international crisis. Just hours ago, the U.S. military announced a successful test of its THAAD missile defense system not long after flying U.S. bombers over the Korean peninsula. This is in direct response to a Friday ballistic missile launch by North Korea. Meanwhile, President Trump is taking aim at China, saying he's very disappointed in that country. Quote, "They do nothing for us with North Korea, just talk. We will no longer allow this to continue. China could easily solve this problem." All of this is sure to make for an interesting first day on the job for John Kelly. He's also dealing with a White House in something of a chaotic situation, plus the health care bill the president insists is still alive. Joining me now to talk about this is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, former Congressman Mick Mulvaney. Director Mulvaney, always good to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
Jake, thanks very much for having me as always.
I know you want to talk about policy, but I do just want to ask about some of the White House personnel issues. When General Kelly is sworn in on Monday as White House Chief of Staff, will all staff members immediately begin reporting to him?
I don't know. I answer to the Chief of Staff, and I will continue to do that. The Office of Management and Budget actually reports directly to the Chief of Staff. Obviously, we answer to the President, as everybody does in the West Wing. But as far as I know, my reporting doesn't change, nor do I have any reason for it to change. So we'll continue to do our business at OMB the same way we did last week. I think we're doing some good work and look forward to continuing that under General Kelly's leadership.
I guess one of the reasons I'm asking is just because some of the people who have worked at the White House or work continuously at the White House say that because there are so many different power centers and people who seemingly have equal status to the Chief of Staff, it can be confusing, and that's one of the reasons for the chaos. So, for instance, do you happen to know if Anthony Scaramucci, the new communications director, who said when he came on board that he reports directly to the president, will he have to report to John Kelly? Do you have any idea?
Again, I've seen those same reports, and I recognize that sort of narrative is out there. All I know is it's very clear what we do at OMB, and that's not going to change. So I really can't speak to the other reporting within the White House.
Let me turn to health care. Following this week's collapse of Republican efforts to repeal Obamacare and, on occasion, replace it, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he's ready to move on to other issues. President Trump seems pretty stuck on the issue. He's been tweeting about it all weekend long, including this morning. This is what he tweeted yesterday, quote, "Unless the Republican senators are total quitters, repeal and replace is not dead. Demand another vote before voting on any other bill." Is this official White House policy that nothing should be voted on in Congress, not even the debt ceiling, before it's on health care?
Well, I think, yes. And I think what you're seeing there is the president simply reflecting the mood of the people. Go and poll the American public and find out what the most important issue is to them right now, and it's health care. So in the White House's view, they can't move on in the Senate. In the people's view, they should move on in the Senate. They should stay and work and figure out a way to solve this problem. Keep in mind, you're talking about something they've promised to do for 7 years. You can't promise folks you're going to do something for 7 years and then not do it. In addition to this policy consideration, you do have Obamacare. It is failing. It is hurting people. So to not change it allows that to go forward. That's a policy consideration. At the same time, you have the political consideration that you promise folks you do this for 7 years. You cannot go back on that. So yes, they need to stay. They need to work. They need to pass something. And I think that's not only official White House position on this right now, it's sort of the national attitude towards it.
Well, their polls indicate that the American people, a plurality of them, I don't want to get a hold of the American people. I do ask you about a tweet that President Trump sent out Saturday that it was kind of cryptic. He wrote, "If a new health care bill is not approved quickly, bailouts for insurance companies and bailouts for members of Congress will end very soon." Is on the bailouts for insurance companies, I'll get to that in a second, but is the president threatening to cut off funding for the health insurance plans for members of Congress. Is that what that means, bailouts for members of Congress?
Yeah, actually, I talked to the president at length about that exact issue yesterday, and I think his attitude is this, and his attitude is pretty simple. Keep in mind, he does have this way of charging a number of the American public, and what he's saying is, look, Obamacare is hurting people, and it is. Then why shouldn't it hurt insurance companies and, more importantly, perhaps for this discussion, members of Congress? There is a certain benefit that members of Congress get as part of an OPM decision from a couple years ago, and I think the president's simply looking at this and going, is this fair? Is it fair that Obamacare is hurting people, that if you live in a county that's what we call now a bare county with no coverage, if you're obliged by law to buy something that's not for sale and that's hurting you, or if you've got a coverage but can't afford to go to the doctor and that's hurting you, shouldn't insurance companies and members of Congress bear some of that burden as well? So I'm familiar with that issue. We'll see what happens as we move forward.
So that's on the chopping block, perhaps taking away the health care plans, the health insurance plans for members of Congress. Would he target staff members for this as well?
Keep in mind, Jake, back up just a second. You don't take away coverage for members of Congress and so forth. Members of Congress are obliged by law to participate in the exchanges. I did when I was a member of Congress. But there was also a decision from the Office of Personnel Management a couple years ago that allowed a special exemption to the rules on employer contributions to those plans. So it's not a concept of taking coverage away. It's the approach of actually obliging members of Congress to follow the exact law that the folks that they govern are following.
So forcing them onto the Obamacare exchanges, is that what it is?
No, they are already.
Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. A dramatic moment on Capitol Hill. Senator John McCain in the wee hours of the morning voting no on the Republicans' latest plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. His vote, along with that of two other Republicans, Murkowski and Collins, was enough to quash the bill. And President Trump, frankly, looked back in anger.
They should have approved health care last night, but you can't have everything. Boy, oh boy. They've been working on that one for 7 years. Can you believe that? The swamp.
Joining me now, one of the three Republican senators who voted no on that legislation, Senator Susan Collins of Maine. Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Jake.
So, Senator, before I get to policy, I just have to ask, I saw this viral video of you getting off an airplane in Bangor, Maine, and a crowd of people spontaneously and organically applauding you. I don't know if that happens to you every time you get off an airplane in Bangor, Maine, but it was a pretty remarkable thing. What is the response you're getting?
It really was so extraordinary, heartwarming, and affirming. I got off the plane, and there was a large group of outbound passengers, none of whom I happened to know. And spontaneously, some of them started applauding, and then virtually all of them started to applaud. It was just amazing. I've never had that happen in the 20 years that I've been privileged to serve in the Senate. So it was very encouraging and affirming, especially arriving back home after a very difficult time.
A very difficult time, very contentious time. President Trump, as you know, is hoping to revive the effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. He needs the vote of one more senator in order to flip someone's vote, whether yours or Murkowski's or McCain's. The president appears to be threatening to cut off funding for the health care plans that members of Congress receive. Would that kind of pressure change your vote?
No, but, you know, the ball is really in our court right now. There are serious problems with the ACA. We're seeing collapsing markets in some areas of the country where even though people have subsidies, they're not going to be able to buy an insurance policy. So our job is not done. And what we need to do is to remember my friend Lamar Alexander's words, which is that he says that Congress doesn't do comprehensive well. We need to go back to committee, to the Health Committee and the Finance Committee, identify the problems, carefully evaluate possible solutions through hearings, and then produce a series of bills to correct these problems, the most serious of which is the pending collapse of the insurance markets. And I certainly hope the administration does not do anything in the meantime to hasten that collapse.
Well, as you note, the president is also threatening to cut off what he calls bailouts for insurance companies. Presumably, he's referring to the payments the government makes to insurance companies to reduce the costs for low-income Americans. The Trump administration has threatened to withhold this money before, which has led to uncertainty among insurance providers. If President Trump were to officially withdraw that funding, would that affect your vote on health care?
It would not affect my vote on health care, but it's an example of why we need to act to make sure that those payments, which are not an insurance company bailout, but rather help people who are very low income afford their out-of-pocket costs towards their deductibles and their co-pays. And that's what we need to remember. So it really would be detrimental to some of the most vulnerable citizens if those payments were cut off. They're paid to the insurance companies, but the people that they benefit are people who make between 100% and 250% of the poverty rate. So we're talking about low-income Americans who would be devastated if those payments were cut off. Though the threat to cut off those payments has contributed to the instability in the insurance market. But what Congress needs to do is to start by the first bill that we should consider is how to stabilize the market. And that is a key component to ensure that those payments continue to be made to benefit low-income Americans.
You were one of 3 Republican senators who voted against the so-called skinny repeal of Obamacare. When did you realize that Senator John McCain was going to join you and Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska in voting no? And what did Vice President Pence say to you when he walked up to you on the Senate floor and tapped you on the back?
Well, Senator McCain had given an extremely eloquent speech on the Senate floor the day before when he had arrived back from Arizona after his devastating diagnosis with brain cancer. And he called for a return to the regular order where we would work together across the aisle to produce legislation. And it's been my experience as well that that is what works best, and that is what produces sound legislation. So he'd given this dramatic and heartfelt speech, but it was only the day of the vote, just a few hours before the vote, that I realized from my conversations with him that he was going to vote no. Vice President Pence had come over originally to break the tie that most people anticipated was going to happen when Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and I voted no. Instead, the vice president ended up coming over to lobby John McCain directly to try to get him to vote yes. And I was talking with John, and I felt this tap on my shoulder, and I turned around, and it's the vice president. And he said to me, "Boy, are you tough." But he softened that by putting his arm around me. And he has always been extremely courteous in his conversations with me. He then started talking with John. We were reminiscing in some ways, and then it was obvious he wanted to have a private conversation with John about the bill, so I stepped aside and did not participate in that part of the bill. But I was very proud of John. Once again, he showed the courage that he's demonstrated throughout his life to do the right thing, even when it's not popular, even when it's hard.
The health care bill is just one of many moments of drama in the last week. There's been a tremendous amount of infighting at the White House, the president attacking his own attorney general, the communications director attacking the now former chief of staff and the president's senior strategist. Is this affecting the president's ability to get his agenda passed on Capitol Hill?
It doesn't really affect the president's agenda. As I said, I really think that the health care bill, and I think it'll be a series of bills, is in our court now. But I don't think it's helpful to the presidency in general. And the president certainly has the right to choose whomever he wants to be on his personal staff. But I certainly hope that his new communications director strikes a different tone than he has in his first week on the job.
I want to ask you a question about governing in the Trump era. When the president tweets, do you consider those tweets to be policy, or should they be ignored in the way the Pentagon seems to be, in a way, treating his tweet about banning transgender people from serving in the military. They seem to be saying, oh, well, he tweeted that, but we don't have any policy, so we're just going to keep on as we're going. How do you take the president's tweets?
I personally don't think that governing or setting policy by tweet is a wise approach. It creates confusion. It does not give...
This is CNN, the most trusted name in news.
Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. President Trump is now threatening to withhold payments to insurance companies that help low-income consumers in retaliation for Republicans failing to move forward on repealing and replacing Obamacare. Joining me now is Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of the great state of Vermont. Senator Sanders, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Let's just plunge right into health care. President Trump threatening on Twitter both lawmakers and insurance companies on Saturday, saying he's prepared to cut off the, quote, bailouts that you and the insurance companies receive. What do you make of these threats?
You know, I really think it's incomprehensible that we have a president of the United States who wants to sabotage health care in America, make life more difficult for millions of people who are struggling now to get the health insurance they need and to pay for that health insurance. Maybe the president should put down his, stop his tweeting for a while and understand that America today is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people, and the solution is not to throw tens of millions of people off of health insurance that they currently have.
What do you make of the threats directly at members of Congress about your health insurance? Mick Mulvaney was on the show earlier trying to explain what the threat exactly meant.
Well, I would turn that around a little bit and say to the President of the United States that, yes, every single American in every state in this country should be able to get the health care that members of Congress have. And that is why, if we are able to return to regular order, if we are able to have a serious debate on the health care crisis, I think there should be a public option available in every state in this country. If people don't like the private insurance that they're getting, if it's too expensive, they should have a Medicare-type public option available in every state in this country. And that's one of the ways forward.
When you were on the program on July 2nd, you told me you were going to introduce a single-payer health care plan literally as soon as we're through with the Republican health care debate. It seems like we're through, and the Obamacare repeal effort has collapsed. Are you going to introduce single-payer?
Absolutely. Of course we are. We're just, we're tweaking the final points of the bill, and we're figuring out how we can mount a national campaign to bring people together. Here's where we are, Jake, and it's important for Americans to understand this. We are the only major country on earth, the only one, not to guarantee health care to all people. The result is 28 million people who are uninsured, millions of people who are paying deductibles and co-payments that are far too high. And if the Republicans had gotten their way, there would have been another 30 or 32 million people thrown off of health insurance. That is crazy. What we should do is move in the direction of every other major country, guarantee health care to all people as a right, not a privilege. Second thing you got to do is ask ourselves a very simple question, which my Republican friends and the president does not. Why is it that in America, per capita, we are spending far, far more on health care than do the people of any other country? Why are we paying by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs compared to people all over the world? Those are the issues we've got to tackle. And I think the answer is pretty obvious. What we have now is a health care system not designed to guarantee health care to all of our people in a cost-effective way. What we have is a dysfunctional, complicated healthcare system designed to make as much profit as possible for insurance companies and drug companies. And you have an incredible bureau. Go ahead.
I want to get into single payer. Just the quick note: the 32 million figure that the senator is referring to is from a Congressional Budget Office study of what happens if there was full repeal of Obamacare with no replacement. Some of those, of course, are people voluntarily getting off health care because there's no more punishment. But let's talk about single payer, because it was attempted in your home state of Vermont, and it didn't work because they couldn't get the funding because it would be too expensive, the Democratic governor said. And then recently it failed in California as well. Democrats, again, not able to come up with a way to pay for it. These are cobalt blue states, Vermont and California, where people wanted single payer, and there were problems because it would cost too much. How do you make it national if you can't even get it in Vermont or California?
Well, it's not. No. Let's be let's be careful about this.
All right.
A single-payer health care system, in my view, and according to studies that I have seen, would save the average family significant sums of money. And what Republicans sometimes do is confuse the issue. And they say, well, you're going to pay more in taxes. What they forget to tell you is that if you are a family of four, now paying $15,000 or $20,000 a year in private health insurance, you're not going to be paying that at all. Once again, if you look at Canada's single-payer health care system, per capita, their costs are far, far less than the United States. If you look at the UK, if you look at countries around the world, all of which have different approaches to a national health care system, in every instance, they are spending substantially less per capita than we spend in the United States, substantially less for prescription drugs. The problem with our system is it is so complicated for the consumer, for the doctors, is that a hospital, for example, might be dealing with 15, 20, 30 different insurance policies. It takes an enormous amount of time, energy, and expense to figure out that you have a $5,000 deductible, you have a $10,000 deductible. The goal simply is to say that every person in this country, through a single-payer system, is entitled to a comprehensive health care approach, and that will save substantial sums of money in administrative costs, substantial sums of money in lower prescription drug costs, substantial sums of money in doing away with the profiteering of the drug companies. By the way, the 5 top drug companies in 2015 made $50 billion in profit. These CEOs in the healthcare industry make enormous salaries.
Right.
We should join the rest of the world, begin that discussion immediately, and I will be introducing legislation to do just that.
Well, why couldn't this happen in Vermont then? I mean, what's the issue in Vermont? Vermont would be would seem to be a perfect test case.
Well, politically, this is difficult. And by the way, in California, the debate is not over. It passed, I think, the Senate. It's now gone to the House, and that debate will continue. Look, taking on the insurance companies and the drug companies, taking on Wall Street, taking on a lot of very powerful forces that make billions of dollars a year from the current healthcare system is not going to be easy. And it's not going to take place until millions of people get involved in the struggle and appreciate the fact that whether you're rich or whether
prescription drugs to